Good morning. I don't know if anyone's told you yet, but you look great in yellow. I'm not going to answer any questions probably, so if any of you can't hear me and you would like to, just raise your hand and I will get louder. My name is Skylar Bailey. I am a political independent. I am convinced by the available evidence that the global climate has been warming over the past several decades. I think there's some pretty solid evidence.
Well, would you mind holding this for a few minutes? I have to run out. Yes, there's people.
Yet here I am, standing in a yellow vest in a snowstorm to find you. So here is the story of how that when the Essex Plan was first made public, I determined to have an honest look at it to judge it by its merits. My suspicions were raised when its authors claimed the plan would be both revenue neutral and a good source of revenue for funding the development of new technology. It seemed to promise that everyone would get back more than they paid in, that the state would make bundles of money to fund all kinds of climate initiatives, that 6,000 jobs would be created, and that Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions would be cut in half by 2050, thereby saving the world. It seemed too good to be true. But it was a sales pitch. You'll have that. So I wanted to look at it from the perspective of a cost-benefit analysis. Does the potential cost of a carbon tax justify the expected decrease in greenhouse gas emissions? So first, how much of a decrease in emissions could be expected? The Essex Plan claims it would result in reductions of 15 to 25% by 2025 and 30 to 50% by 2050. But no citations were provided telling us where these figures come from. The bibliography of the Essex Plan contains 16 sources. Only one of them ever mentions possible emissions decreases. The rest deal entirely with health or economic impacts on industries, energy sectors, and various segments of the population. The one source that did mention emissions was a report prepared by Regional Economic Models Incorporated called The Economic, Fiscal, Emissions, and Demographic Implications from a Carbon Price Policy in Vermont. So I went and I read that report. It's 43 pages long, but all of it that is dedicated to any potential changes in emissions due to carbon taxes is one paragraph and 3 charts, roughly matching the huge percentages of reductions claimed under the Essex Plan. So that is apparently where the authors of the Essex Plan got their claim. But where did the data from these charts come from? There were 2 links provided as sources for them, both from the EPA, and I followed them. One link goes to a page with information about how to find out how clean your local electricity generation is, but nothing at all about decreases in emissions from carbon taxes. And the other goes to a page with a list of information about how energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other emerging technologies can be good for the environment, but nothing about decreases in emissions from carbon taxes. And there the trail goes cold. The authors of the Essex Plan, despite their lofty claims, provided not one shred of cited information about whether their proposal could be expected to decrease greenhouse gas emissions at all. So I started looking for other evidence that might tell me how much a carbon tax might be expected to lower Vermont's emissions. I found a wide variety of studies and reports made by pro-carbon tax groups. Although most of them dealt entirely with the economic impacts of carbon taxes, some of them did address their possible effects on emissions. These fall pretty neatly into 3 categories. The first category are papers that claim to predict the hypothetical future impact of a carbon tax that has not been enacted. A good example of this is a report made by a group of researchers from National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They developed a computer model with MIT using methodologies they never describe in their report And this computer model projected that the enactment of a carbon tax, significantly higher than that proposed under the Essex Plan, might lower emissions over time. Then they went on a lengthy discussion of the economic impacts of such taxes and how to mitigate them. The fact that the methodology and logic of the computer projection were not disclosed in their report did not convince me that it was anything more than a team of economists having a computer repeat back to them their own potentially false assumptions in projection form. It was too hypothetical. I was hoping for something more concrete. So I looked for reports about the effects of carbon taxes that had actually been enacted. The second category essentially runs the same way as the first category, but retroactively. Rather than using a computer model to project the theoretical effect of a future carbon tax, they meant to use one to derive the effects of a tax that had already been implemented. Here is a notable example that has often been cited in favor of carbon pricing. In 1991, Norway instituted the highest carbon tax in the world. By 1999, emissions had increased 18.7%. A pair of Norwegian environmental statisticians devised a computer model, the methodology of which they never described, that says that emissions would have increased by another 2% had there been no tax. And again, 9/10 of this report is about the effect of the tax on Norway's economy. The third category consists of claims based on real carbon emissions after the implementation of carbon taxes. These tend to say things like, Germany's carbon tax came into effect in 2003 and caused a 7.5% decrease in emissions in 10 years. I fact-checked all of the statistics in these claims and found them to be accurate numbers. But we all know that correlation is not causation, and I wanted to be certain that the taxes had caused the decreases. If Germany's emissions decreased 7.5% in the decade before the tax and 7.5% in the decade after, then the tax cannot be said to have had any real effect. In the same way, if Germany saw a 7.5% decrease, but so did surrounding countries that did not institute carbon taxes, then it is very difficult to credit the tax with a decrease. So I set out collecting data on the real-world effect of carbon taxes on emissions. I thought that Europe would provide a good case study for making valid comparisons, since there are a large number of modern, developed countries with similar industries in close proximity, with a patchwork history of taxing carbon going back almost 30 years. I gathered information about the timeline and extent of European carbon taxation programs and collected annual per capita carbon emissions from Eurostat. I want to be clear. Going into this, I expected that the Norwegian model would prove to be correct and that a carbon tax like that in the Essex Plan would probably correlate with a 2% reduction in emissions over 10 years, and that I was going to continue my research by then trying to determine whether the cost would be worth it. But I never got that far, because here is what I found. The German carbon tax took full effect in 2003 and is claimed to have caused a 7.5% decrease in the 10 years after its implementation. Germany experienced a 21.2% decrease during the decade prior to the tax. The same pattern holds true for other European countries often held up as success stories. The emissions of the United Kingdom, Ireland, and France decreased faster before the implementation of their carbon taxes than after. Norway and Iceland saw no noticeable change in trends following the implementation of their carbon pricing initiatives, and Latvia and Estonia have had rising emissions since the passage of carbon taxes. Taken as a whole, European countries with carbon taxes have generally seen their emissions decrease, even if in many countries less rapidly than had been the case prior to the tax. But when we compare countries that taxed carbon with their neighbors that did not, the evidence turns starkly against carbon pricing. The Netherlands began pricing carbon in 1990, and during the following 23 years, per capita emissions decreased 15.9%. And this would be quite the achievement were it not for the fact that neighboring Belgium never passed a carbon tax, and during the same period saw more than double the decrease in emissions. Slovenia instituted a carbon tax in 1996 and saw a 2% increase in emissions in the following 17 years. Slovakia had no tax and saw a 20% decrease during that time. When we average them out, since 1990, European countries without carbon taxes have seen per capita greenhouse gas emissions decrease 37.5% faster than countries with carbon taxes.
Wow.
And since 2005, non-carbon taxing countries' emissions have fallen almost twice as fast. Looking at the numbers, the implementation of carbon taxes over extended periods appears to cut a country's ability to decrease emissions in half. These findings left me absolutely floored, and for a long time I did not know what to make of them. Why would carbon taxes appear to work against decreasing carbon emissions? At first it was enough for me to say only that no real-world evidence existed to indicate that carbon taxes work, but over time I have developed two possible theories. First, if country A spends 3 years proposing, negotiating, and finally passing a carbon tax that won't actually lower emissions, and country B doesn't, then country B has 3 years to spend passing and implementing other climate initiatives that might actually work. Second, the people of country A may be more reticent to pass future climate initiatives than the people of country B, since the carbon tax is already costing them a lot of money personally. They may be disinclined to enact any further policies, especially since those policies will likely be proposed by the exact same people who proposed the carbon tax. They may feel as though they are already sacrificing a great deal for the cause, and thus not be interested in sacrificing more. Why carbon taxes don't work is no mystery. Gasoline and heating oil are necessities, and ready alternatives do not exist. Higher prices for inelastic commodities do not result in significant decreases in demand until those price increases become very severe. The only way a tax on gasoline and heating fuel will lower emissions is if it hurts people badly enough that they must choose between heat and food. The push for a carbon tax in Vermont is not based on reason, facts, or honest statistical analysis. No evidence exists that they have caused decreased emissions anywhere they have been tried. And this will really hurt real people who have no other options available to them but to use fossil fuels. There is a small but active group of citizens and legislators who have fallen prey to simple confirmation bias. They have become like a religious cult, pushing a faith-based policy proposal which exists wholly apart from any reality-based discussion of its merits or lack thereof. They will repeat baseless claims that carbon taxes are the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or even that they work at all. There are some large businesses and institutions in Vermont that stand to gain a great deal from this proposal. They are going to spend vast sums of money on lobbyists to try to sell their plan to our lawmakers. Some of our legislators are philosophically opposed to a carbon tax. Some are not in favor of increasing taxes in such a regressive way. Many are going into this question as I did, with open minds, waiting to hear these pitches and see the data before casting their votes. I call upon our legislators to dig into all of their claims.
Hear, hear.
Dig to their sources and to the sources for those sources, and judge these proposals on their merits. If they do, they will realize that no evidence exists that carbon taxes have caused any decreases in emissions in the countries where they have been tried. Carbon taxes are the most expensive and least effective climate initiative possible. Every reasonable legislator who cares about Vermonters, about the poor, the rural, the tradespeople, the elderly, the young people who are trying to decide where they will live out their days, and especially about future generations of Vermonters who will bear the full brunt of the decisions we make now, you must vote no on any and every carbon tax proposed. Thank you.